They say there's no place like home, but the truth is, there's no place like a home you never knew you owned. When Gerald Vance's son packed his bags, drove him to a pristine assisted living facility, and handed over a rushed power of attorney, Gerald wasn't a resident. He was the landlord. The intake coordinator pulled his file and froze. Gerald hadn't just toured this facility before. He had built it from the ground up, and every single brick still belonged to him. Gerald Vance was a retired developer who spent his life building assisted living facilities. But when his son checked him into one, intending to drain his fortune through a fraudulent power of attorney, Gerald didn't just fight back. The nightmare began with a simple signature on a form his daughter-in-law called a tour waiver. Gerald Vance was 73 years old, a man who had spent 4 decades constructing the very buildings that promised dignity to people in their final chapters. He had built and still owned, through a quiet portfolio company, 14 assisted living facilities across 3 states. He understood concrete, zoning laws, and the soft mathematics of compassion. What he did not understand, not yet, was that the people closest to him had been studying a different set of blueprints entirely. His son, Marcus, was 47, a man with expensive taste and a career that never quite caught fire. Marcus had spent 20 years drifting through ventures his father quietly funded, always with a plausible explanation for why this one, unlike the last 4, would finally take off. Gerald loved his son. That was the fault line that ran beneath everything. He loved him, and love had made him generous, and generosity had been mistaken for weakness by a man who could not tell the difference. Marcus's wife, Candace, was sharper. She was the one who noticed that Gerald's signature on a power of attorney document could, in the right hands, become a skeleton key. She was the one who started the conversations about how Gerald was slowing down, how the big house was too much for him, how a trial stay at a lovely facility would be good for his health. She said the word tour like it was a gift. She used language that sounded like care. She was, in retrospect, terrifyingly good at it. Gerald agreed to the tour on a Tuesday morning in March. He did not need assisted living. He was sharp, mobile, and still reviewed quarterly reports from his portfolio company every month. But Marcus had been insistent, and Candace had framed it as a gesture of love, a way for Gerald to see the kind of facility his own work had inspired. That was the phrase she used. See the kind of facility your work inspired. It was a beautiful lie, and Gerald, trusting his family, walked through the front doors of a building that, though he did not know it yet, he had personally financed from the ground up. The tour lasted 40 minutes. The administrator, a woman named Margaret Holloway who had worked for Gerald's company for 2 decades, was not on shift that day. The front desk staff were new. No one recognized his name. At the end of the tour, Candace produced a clipboard. She called it a tour waiver, a standard consent form for the facility's records. Gerald, still believing he was simply being a good sport, signed it. The signature was all Marcus needed. Within hours, that signature was presented as a voluntary admission request. Gerald's phone disappeared, quietly removed from his jacket by Candace, while he was being shown a room he had never agreed to occupy. By the time he realized he was not leaving, the doors had locked behind him, not physically, but procedurally. The paperwork was in motion, and 300 miles away, Marcus was already at a bank, power of attorney in hand, emptying accounts that Gerald had spent a lifetime filling. Gerald sat on the edge of a crisply made bed in a room that smelled of lavender and antiseptic, running the last hour through his mind. The tour had felt off from the beginning, but he had dismissed it as the natural awkwardness of seeing a place like this from the inside. Now the door was not locked, but the message from the front desk was clear. He was a resident, not a visitor. When he asked for his phone, a young staff member told him it would be returned after the intake assessment. He never saw it again. Every year in the United States, financial elder abuse costs seniors an estimated $2.6 billion to $36.5 billion. The most common perpetrator is not a stranger. It is an adult child, a son or daughter who has access, who knows the account numbers, who has been trusted with a power of attorney and sees it not as a responsibility, but as a withdrawal slip. Gerald Vance did not yet know the full scale of what was happening, but his gut, the same instinct that had guided him through 40 years of negotiations and land deals, was screaming. The intake assessment never came. Instead, a series of staff members entered and exited with clipboards, none of them making eye contact. Gerald, still believing he could clear up the misunderstanding, asked to speak with the facility director. He was told she would be in tomorrow. He asked to make a phone call. He was told the phones were for medical emergencies only. He was 73, not senile, and he understood perfectly what was happening. He just could not believe it was his own son who had orchestrated it. Marcus Vance had always been a disappointment in ways that Gerald had trained himself not to name. He was charming, yes. He could walk into a room and make everyone feel like the most important person in it. But the charm was a currency he spent faster than he earned. Over the years, Gerald had covered failed restaurants, a real estate venture that collapsed, and a technology startup that was really just a website with an expensive logo. Each time Marcus had promised it was the last. Each time Candace had reinforced the narrative. Your father just wants to see you succeed. And Gerald, who had built his fortune from nothing, wanted to believe that his son could do the same. But Marcus did not want to build. He wanted to inherit. And when he realized that Gerald intended to leave the bulk of his estate to a foundation that would audit and improve elder care, Marcus decided he could not wait. The power of attorney document had been presented during a family dinner 3 months earlier, framed as a precautionary measure. You never know what might happen, Dad. We just want to make sure someone can handle things if you get sick. Gerald, who had just turned 73 and felt fine, signed it without reading the fine print. It was one of the last real conversations they ever had. The morning after his admission, Gerald woke to the sound of a breakfast tray being placed on his nightstand. He had not slept. He had spent the night cataloging every exit, every staff member, every flicker of recognition in their faces. And then, at 9:45 in the morning, Margaret Holloway walked through the front doors to begin her shift. Margaret had worked for Vance Senior Living Partners for 20 years. She had started as a receptionist and worked her way up to facility administrator. She had met Gerald a dozen times at corporate retreats and groundbreakings. She knew his face the way you know the face of someone who signed your paychecks for 2 decades. When she saw the name on the new resident intake form, she assumed it was a coincidence. Gerald Vance was not an uncommon name. But when she walked past his room and saw him sitting in the chair by the window, wearing the same camel-colored overcoat he had worn to the groundbreaking of this very facility 7 years earlier, she stopped cold. She pulled the intake file from the front desk and scanned it again. The name matched. The date of birth matched. She walked to the records room and pulled the ownership documents. Gerald Vance, sole owner through a portfolio company she had reported to for her entire career, was listed as a resident in a building he still held the deed to. Margaret took a breath that did not feel entirely steady. She had seen family disputes before. She had seen children dump parents in facilities and disappear. But this was different. This was not just abandonment. This was a coup. She walked back to Gerald's room, knocked softly, and closed the door behind her. Mr. Vance, she said quietly, I don't know if you remember me, I'm Margaret Holloway. I've worked for you for 20 years, and I think you need to know that your son and daughter-in-law are currently liquidating your accounts. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. He did not cry out. He did not panic. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when a suspicion that has been gnawing at him finally gets confirmed. How bad is it? He asked. Margaret told him what she had seen. The power of attorney was on file, and it had been used that morning to initiate a transfer of $250,000 from his primary account. Marcus had also contacted the company's attorney, claiming Gerald was incapacitated, seeking control of the portfolio. The gears were turning fast, but Marcus had made one catastrophic error. He had checked his father into a facility that his father owned. And the person who held the keys to that facility had just walked into the room and placed them back in Gerald's hands. Give me a phone, Gerald said, not the facility phone, a phone that can't be traced back to Marcus. Margaret handed him her personal cell phone. Gerald dialed a number he knew by heart, the direct line to his corporate attorney, a man named David Lasker who had been with him for 30 years and had drafted the very documents Marcus was now trying to exploit. David, Gerald said, his voice calm and entirely controlled. I need you to do 3 things. Revoke the power of attorney immediately, freeze every account Marcus has accessed, and send a car. I'm not staying in this building as a patient. I'm staying as the owner. Because as of this moment, I'm conducting a full audit of how this facility and every facility under my name treats the people who really are trapped here. And Marcus. He's about to find out that the retirement he planned for me is going to look a lot like his own. David Lasker arrived with a legal team and a level of precision that only 30 years of corporate warfare can produce. Within 2 hours, Gerald's power of attorney was revoked, filed electronically with the state, and a stop payment order had been placed on every account Marcus had touched. The $250,000 that Marcus had transferred that morning never reached his account. It had been frozen mid-wire, caught in the gap between greed and consequence. Marcus did not know it yet, but the clock that had been ticking against his father was now ticking against him. Margaret Holloway provided sworn testimony that afternoon. She detailed how the admission paperwork had been falsified, how the tour waiver Gerald signed had been swapped with a permanent residency form, and how the facility had no consent for his confinement. Her statement, witnessed by two paralegals, became the cornerstone of the elder fraud filing David delivered to the county prosecutor's office before the sun went down. In the state of Gerald's residence, elder fraud exceeding $50,000 was a Class B felony carrying up to 20 years. Marcus had exceeded that threshold 5 times over in a single morning. But here is the part that elevates this from sad family drama to something far darker. When David began his forensic accounting on the accounts Marcus had accessed, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Marcus had not just raided the checking account. He had initiated paperwork to sell one of Gerald's 14 facilities, the very facility Gerald was sitting in, to a third-party buyer that Candace had selected weeks earlier. The sale was scheduled to close in 5 days. The buyer was a private equity firm with a reputation for slashing staff, cutting care, and extracting profit from the bones of what used to be compassionate institutions. Marcus and Candace would have walked away with $8.4 million, and Gerald would have been a resident of a building he no longer owned, with no legal authority to leave. This was not a crime of desperation. It was a crime of architecture. They had been planning this for months, perhaps longer. The facility had been chosen because it was far from Gerald's primary residence. The administrator Margaret was off shift on Tuesday, the day of the tour. Everything had been timed. The only variable they had not accounted for was Margaret Holloway's 20-year memory and the fact that Gerald Vance, even at 73, did not panic. He planned. By nightfall, Gerald had been moved from a resident room to the administrator's office. He was not a patient. He was back to being the CEO. He sat behind Margaret's desk with a laptop and a direct line to his corporate team, reviewing the damage with the same calm he had once used to navigate a hostile takeover attempt in 1992. He learned that Marcus had also contacted 3 of his board members, claiming Gerald was suffering from cognitive decline, hoping to trigger a clause that would allow emergency succession. It was a coup on every front: personal, financial, corporate. And at the center of it all was his own son. The next morning, Gerald did something that surprised even David Lasker. He called Marcus, not through a lawyer, not through a third party. He dialed his son's number from Margaret's phone, the same one he had used to call David. It rang 4 times. Marcus answered. His voice was hesitant, unsure. "Dad, I thought you were in the facility." Gerald's reply was quiet, sad, and completely disarming. "I am, son, but I'm not staying as a resident. I'm here as the owner." There was a long pause on the line, the kind of pause that contains entire worlds collapsing. Marcus tried to recover, to spin, to explain that it was all for Gerald's own good, that the doctors had recommended it, that he was just trying to protect him. Gerald listened without interrupting. When Marcus finally ran out of words, Gerald said simply, "I have revoked the power of attorney. The accounts are frozen. The facility sale is cancelled. And the prosecutor's office is preparing charges. You have 24 hours to turn yourself in, return everything you took, and make this as right as it can possibly be. If you don't, I will not protect you." "I can't." Marcus said nothing. The line went dead, but the story does not end with Marcus's silence. Gerald, sitting in that office, made a decision that would transform a personal betrayal into something much larger. He decided to stay, not as a victim, not as a patient. As an auditor, he announced to his corporate team that he would be spending the next 30 days living in his own facilities, unannounced, eating the food, sleeping in the beds, talking to the residents who could not leave. He wanted to see how his empire treated the people who had no Gerald Vance to call for help. What he discovered over those 30 days would change everything. He found over-medicated patients staring at walls. He found call buttons that went unanswered for hours. He found profit-first policies that had crept in during his retirement, decisions made by managers who had never met a resident. He found a system that, in many ways, had become the very thing he had spent his life trying to avoid. And he realized that his son's betrayal was not just a family crime. It was a symptom. a symptom of a culture that treats the elderly as assets to be managed instead of people to be honored. And Gerald Vance, at 73, decided that the last act of his life would be to change that. But before he could launch his reforms, there was one more piece of family business to settle. Marcus did not turn himself in. The 24 hours came and went without a call, without an apology, without any sign that the son understood the gravity of what he had done. Gerald did not hesitate. He gave the prosecutor everything: the falsified admission forms, the wire transfer records, the emails between Marcus and Candice planning the facility sale, all of it. Marcus Vance was arrested at his home on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the phone call. Candice was charged as a co-conspirator. The case made local headlines, then regional, then national. A real estate developer checked into his own building by the son who tried to steal it. It was the kind of story that taught law students about elder fraud and taught families about the danger of trust misplaced. In court, Marcus's defense crumbled. The paper trail was too thorough, the testimony from Margaret Holloway too precise. He accepted a plea deal that included 7 years in federal prison, full restitution, and a permanent no-contact order with his father and the facilities Gerald owned. Candice received 4 years. Gerald did not attend the sentencing. He was too busy. He had spent those months doing exactly what he said he would. He stayed in the facility for 30 days, then moved to the next one and the next. He checked into his own facilities unannounced, ate the meals, spoke with residents in the hallways, and documented everything. What he found was worse than he expected. In one facility, staffing levels had been cut below safe minimums. In another, residents with dementia were being chemically restrained with medications that should have been a last resort, not a daily routine. In a third, the food budget had been slashed so severely that residents were losing weight. These were not isolated problems. They were the result of decisions made in boardrooms by people who never saw a single resident's face. Gerald fired 3 regional managers. He redirected $20 million from his personal holdings into an immediate reform fund. He mandated that every facility implement a resident-first audit, overseen by an independent board that included former nurses, family advocates, and a geriatrician he hired personally. He then established the Vance Elder Dignity Foundation, funded with the proceeds from the sale of 2 non-core properties, to push for legislative changes and fund legal support for victims of elder fraud nationwide. The man who had been nearly trapped by a broken system spent the last years of his life fixing it. And then there was the inheritance. Gerald had one grandchild, a 19-year-old named Chloe, Marcus's daughter from a marriage that had ended years before. Chloe had never been close to her father, and when she learned what he had done, she disowned him publicly. She had been raised mostly by Gerald after her parents' divorce, and she shared his quiet work ethic. Gerald rewrote his entire estate plan. Marcus was disinherited entirely, the legal maximum allowed. Candice received nothing. The company and all 14 facilities were placed in a trust with Chloe as the sole beneficiary, to be managed by an ethical board until she turned 30. She would inherit not just the buildings, but the mission. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, 6 months after the arrest, Gerald sat with Chloe on the porch of his home in Beckley, the one with the tomato garden, and told her what he had learned. He said, "I spent 40 years building places for people to grow old with dignity. I nearly lost my own dignity in one of my own buildings. That can't happen to anyone else." She took his hand and said, "It won't." She was 19, but in that moment, she sounded like the future he had been fighting for. Gerald Vance died 2 years later, peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by people who loved him. His last words, reported by Chloe, were simply, "The tomatoes need watering," which, if you knew the man, was exactly the exit you would expect. The foundation continued its work. The facilities improved. And somewhere in a federal prison, Marcus Vance had 7 years to think about the day he tried to steal an empire and instead gave his father a legacy that would last generations. The best revenge, as they say, isn't revenge at all. It's making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. And Gerald Vance did exactly that. Gerald's story stayed with me long after I finished the research, not because of the scale of the betrayal, though that was staggering, but because of how close it came to succeeding. The paperwork was signed. The wire transfer was in motion. If Margaret Holloway had taken a different shift that day, Gerald Vance would have died in a facility he built, while his son drained the last of his accounts. And no one would have ever known. The The statistics back this up. 1 in 10 older adults experiences some form of abuse. The most common perpetrator is an adult child, not a stranger, not a scam caller from overseas, a son or daughter with the keys to the house and the account numbers. Power of attorney, a document designed to protect, becomes a license to empty a lifetime of savings. Gerald got lucky. He had the resources, the connections, and a 20-year employee who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Most seniors have none of that. So the question I keep coming back to is this. What about the ones who don't own the building? Who checks on them? Who audits the call lights that never get answered and the medications that quiet instead of heal? Gerald's foundation is doing that work now, but the problem is bigger than one man's legacy. It always is. If you made it this far, thank you. Stories like this take weeks to research and write, and the only way they keep getting told is if you hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that real, meaningful stories still matter. And if you have a story from your own family, drop it in the comments. I read as many as I can, because the truth is, every facility has a Gerald. Every family has a Marcus. The only difference is who picks up the phone.